But if we think that most everyone is here, we could go ahead and get started. Never hurts to have an additional few minutes, I suppose. My method is really just to simply read these stories so that we can kind of see the scriptures that we're looking at. But there are traditionally seven scriptural passages that have been used in the church for 50 years at least, but probably a little longer than that. But are the seven verses that have been used to condemn LGBTQ people. And I want to just take a look at what each of those verses says. So we're going to begin with the mother of them all, which is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah that is found in Genesis chapter 19. And if you're coming back next week, you might bring a Bible with you, because we're actually going to read some scriptures. But I can do most of the readings today. But what I want to do is in Genesis chapter 19, let's read the story at hand so that we can hear it first of all, and then we'll respond to it. So I'm beginning in Genesis chapter 19, and this is the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. I consider this to be the best translation that is out there, and it has been scrutinized a lot by biblical scholars and language scholars and everything. So it's my Bible of preference. There are a couple of others that have taken some of the unfamiliar biblical language and kind of retranslated that to sound more like the way that we talk to each other. And there are a few of those. The Common English Bible is a really, CEV, is a really good translation as well. But I'll just read from the plain old New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Okay? So, Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. The two angels. So first of all, the characters in this story as we begin are angels. They're not people. Okay? So the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, and then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before and what I want you to pay attention to is how these strangers are being treated. Okay? But before they lay down, the men of the city, and that's the word I want to point out, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men?" And they called the angels men. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please." We never talk about that part of the story. "Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down, but the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door, and they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law or sons, daughters, anyone you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord." These are the angels talking to this time. The guests, the strangers, asking, "Have you anyone else here? Get them out of here, because we're about to destroy this place." Okay? For we're about to destroy the place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord. And the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-laws and so forth. I'm going to kind of skip that part. I would like to jump down to see, let's go to, I wrote this into my notes. Look down at verse 30. Because I want you to take note of this part of the story too. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and settled in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the world," which is Bible speak for we don't have anybody to have sex with. "Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father." So that's in the Bible. Is that okay with everybody? So the story goes on. And when we read things like this, there are a lot of signals to us. This is another time in another place, right? Different world. Okay. But here's the part that I want to focus on. In verse 4, I did raise this as we got there. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot. And then Lot said, "No, leave our guests alone, but hey, if you want to have your way with my daughters, that's cool." Right? Okay. But here's the kicker. That word in the Hebrew text is anshi. If you look at your study guide, you'll see what that looks like in Hebrew. That word that is translated men, that word never, ever means men. Not in the Hebrew. That word is that generalized word, we might say humankind or mortals, or in this case we might say the citizens. But the point is here to portray Sodom as a city that's corrupt through and through, men, women, kids, and all. And just think how different this reads if you say, "He said, 'Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, and then we can rise early and go on their way.' And they said, 'No, we'll spend the night in the square.' But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made a feast and baked the unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the whole freaking city showed up. Kids, moms, children, teenagers, everybody. The whole town showed up. And they did kind of allude to this in this translation, because it says both young and old, all of the people to the last, but then they say the last man again. That word is not man. Just imagine historically how different we would have read this story if we had simply not had a bad translation of the Hebrew there.
They genderized it.
Yeah, they genderized it and turned the assault into, because the guests were identified as men or males, even though they turned the assault into a male on male situation. It was clear to Lot also what kind of situation they were talking about, because he offered his daughters up. You know, now that ought to horrify us. But very simply, the Hebrew word, that's an example of bad translation that was influenced by the current meaning of terms in the translator's time. By the time our Bibles were translated, this story of Sodom already had been in the church's mind, and we know what that's about. But what we know it's about turns out it's not about that at all. In fact, when we'll read these other passages in just a minute, but that Hebrew word also for Sodom, not just the word for men, anshi, which doesn't ever mean males. It means mortals, humans, everybody. The word Sodom also has no sexual meaning. The city is mentioned only 2 more times in the Bible, and neither time is it mentioned with any kind of a sexual connotation to it. In Jeremiah chapter 23, in verses 13 and 14, it's just kind of mentioned as a city. But in Ezekiel, I want to show you, if you have your Bibles, go over to Ezekiel chapter 16, because in Ezekiel, the Bible translates for itself what that story in Genesis means. In Ezekiel chapter 16, we'll read verses 48 through 51, just to give a little context.
You said Ezekiel.
Ezekiel 16, verse 48. As I live, says the Lord God, your sister Sodom and your daughters, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. So even Sodom is worse than you. Or no, you're worse even than Sodom, right? This is God speaking. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. So God speaking, saying, look, not even Sodom was as bad as you, but this was the sin of Sodom. God speaking here in this story. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. Didn't say a word about homosexuality, did they? It's hard for us really to get a grasp sometimes on the kind of hospitality codes that existed in the ancient Middle East. But to have strangers come up to your house and not offer water for their animals and not offer shelter and things was just unthinkable. I mean, it was like just one of us hearing that somebody just walked up to somebody out in the street and spit in their face. I mean, that's shocking and awful and something that in our culture we would never do. Well, in this culture, they would never have 2 strangers come to a house, and especially the house of a kind of a prominent citizen, and tell them, sorry guys, out of luck, move on down the road. There's no place for you here. That just wasn't the way it worked in those days.
So verse 50 that says they were haughty and did an abomination before me is referring to the fact that they did not welcome.
Yeah, they didn't, and he says also they had this abundance and they didn't share it with anyone.
So that was not a sexual abomination.
No.
It goes on in 51 to say Samaria has not committed half your...
Yeah.
And Samaria wasn't accused of sexual carrying on, like...
Samaria was?
No, it's not.
Oh, no, I don't know of anything like it.
But it says you have committed more abominations
Yeah.
than they.
So this is a Bible way of saying, nobody's as bad as you are, not even Sodom. But then when we think, oh yeah, all that gay sex happening, they're like, no, here's what Sodom's sin was, is they had an abundance of everything you can share with anyone. And everyone then would have known also that story of the strangers who arrived and Lot welcomed them in. But Sodom, everybody showed up at the door saying, hey, let us have our way with your guests, you know. And again, before we jump on board and use this to condemn people, let's also include the rest of the story where Sodom says, or Lot says, yeah, but you know, my daughters are in here, you can have your way with them. Yeah. So hand-picking little verses out of stories is usually not a really good idea. Cherry picking, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. Also, in verse 5, the word no, back in Genesis again. Genesis 19, verse 5. Where the men, no, the Anshi called out to Lot and said, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. That actually does seem to have some kind of a sexual connotation. But remember, this is men, women, children, boys. This is Sodom, the representative Sodom standing at the door. Everybody there. That word does seem to have a sexual connotation, although that very same word is used over 900 times in the Old Testament, and only 10 times is it ever used with any kind of a sexual connotation. You know, in the story of Mary, where it's announced that she's going to become pregnant, and she said, how can this be, seeing that I know not a man? You know, that is not Mary saying, I've never even met a man. I don't know any men. No, that has a sexual connotation to it. And that's one of those euphemisms that are in the Bible. Although I could not stand in the pulpit and say with assurance that the intention, because they say, bring them out so that we can know them, you know, I mean, maybe, maybe not. I don't know what that means. But it was certainly what the town had in mind. Some kind of a abusive sort of a circumstance, okay? So, in the big story, and then later on, that whole story of Sodom has taken on a life of its own. And it became so firmly ingrained in the minds of Christians and the church that even when well-meaning translators sat down, as soon as the word Sodom gets into the story somewhere, then they've yielded to that idea that what is being condemned here is homosexual rape. and that affected the translators. We'll see later in the New Testament translations, where in long lists of really bad people, there's also the word sodomites, which technically wouldn't have any meaning at all. I mean, it'd be like Montrosites. You know, I mean, it's just a city is what it is. A city with a reputation for being inhospitable to strangers and not very gracious with the abundance that they enjoyed.
So this NIV version says bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them.
Yeah, so that the translators of the NIV made the choice. I'm going to translate it this way. But 900 other times in the Old Testament, that very same word is there with no sexual connotation at all. It just means no. I just don't know.
As in thinking.
Yeah, right. All right, so Genesis chapter 19, and the word Anshi is what you want to really remember there. Because how tragic that we put gender to the whole town showing up, and then turned the great crime that they were contemplating into male and male rape, which lent itself to a lot of condemnation later on as that idea developed, and as the word Sodom came to mean something that there's really no justification for that meaning. Okay, let's look at Leviticus. This is scripture number 2. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 18. And again, I'm going to read a little bit of this so that we can kind of get the larger context.
Are you starting at 1?
No, I'm not gonna read that much, but I would like for you to glance over and just notice that really beginning, well, actually, verse 1 is a good place to start because this gives you the why. Why is this in here? The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I'm the Lord your God, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived. You shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes. My ordinances you shall observe, and my statutes you shall keep following them. I'm the Lord your God, and you'll keep my statutes and my ordinances. By doing so, one shall live. I am the Lord." And then this list starts. "None of you shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father," which we broke that one in Genesis, didn't we? And then just one thing after another. In Old Testament times, these were called holiness codes, and you have, if you go all the way back to chapter 11, you'll see that there's a lot more holiness code in here. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and saying to them, "Speak to the people, saying, from among all the land animals, these are the creatures that you may eat, and these are the ones that you may not." We eat every one of the ones that we may not. Crabs and oysters and, and all kinds of things are in it. And there's instruction in here about don't wear blended materials. But we always have to keep in mind the point of this is you are not to be like those people in Egypt were. You're not to be like the people in Canaan where you're about to live. I want you to stand out. I want you to be holy, which doesn't mean pious. Holy means set apart for a specific purpose. I've used this in sermons and I see you nodding. A chalice is holy. We don't often fill it up with ice cubes and pour tea into it because something feels weird about that, right? Why? Because that chalice is set apart. Your carving knife that you use every year at your turkey dinner is holy. You don't just slice bologna with that thing, do you? You don't get it out of the cabinet even or out of the drawer until Thanksgiving comes around. God wanted God's people to be holy. He didn't want them to be pious. He wanted them to be different, set apart, unique. So he said, cut your hair this way, wear these kind of clothes, eat this sort of food, circumcise your boys. And the idea was, as you live among the nations, I don't want you to look or smell or taste like anybody else. I want you to stand apart. I want you to be weird. Be a little bit weird. And so that's the context. Now we go back to Leviticus chapter 18 where some more code comes up. And also remember that that God is naming these things and saying don't be like Egypt and Canaan apparently means that this stuff went on all the time. So God says, look, this is what happens in those other places where you've lived. And he goes down this list. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father. Well, I don't know what the occasion was in Egypt or Canaan for that. But apparently God felt like we don't want to do that. You know, and on and on and on we go down to verse 22, where you find, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. That's not the only thing in there. There's stuff in here about shrimp too, right? Okay, so let's get it in that big context. And then the question is, first of all, shouldn't that one verse be read in the context of the entire holiness code, which continues on through Leviticus ad nauseum? And you can't imagine all the things that God says, do things this way, not that way, this way, not that way, this way. And a man shall not lie with a woman, or with a man as lying with a woman. So we need to do a little Bible study to get our understanding of, well, what does that mean? Yeah.
Does that have any context to the verse above it, which is about offering your children to Moloch? Or
Yeah.
Defaming God?
Yeah,
Are those verses
that's an important one for
together?
me because I have never once offered my children to Moloch. So see what a good Christian I am? You know, I'm just saying,
You're holy.
this is the context. Right above there says, don't offer your children as a sacrifice to their God. Well, you know, I mean, our God may be capitalism, and have we ever offered our children? Well, let's not start preaching.
And it's okay to have multiple wives.
Yeah, sure.
Can you translate abomination?
Yeah, actually, let me get back to that because it's one of the keys in one of the New Testament where this same word gets translated. But it really just means unconventional or out of keeping with Israel. And eating shrimp is on that list too. Eating pork is on that list. Okay? It's an abomination. Well, that's a translation of a word that also got a little more oomph once we decided Sodom meant male sex, you know, which is also unjustified. So, first question is, shouldn't this be read in the context of the whole holiness code, with the word holiness not meaning sinless and pious and all that? And the holiness code is then prescribed behavior for Israel. It's prescribed behavior for that people that preserves their uniqueness, their otherness, their we're not like them-ness. It preserves that as the unique, distinctive people of a holy, unique, distinctive, not like any other God. So God wanted God's people to be as God is, completely different than all of the competitors. And that was really important. But if you go back again in chapter 11, you see lots of other abominations that are also forbidden by this code. Most of you are breaking some of that right now. If you're wearing a blended polyester or 60% cotton, 40% spandex, or whatever it is. I don't know how to go to church with people like you. Wearing those blended, eating that shrimp. Some of you are probably going to have shrimp for lunch. It's an abomination in the Bible. So what does that mean? It means you're not doing what God asked Israel to do, and that is stand out in the same way that I do. Just don't be like anybody else.
So you're saying these don't apply to us?
They don't, well, you can make up your mind about that. But it certainly isn't justified to pick which ones that do and which ones that don't. Yes, sir.
So I don't know if you intended to address verse 23 or not, but I think it's interesting that
Read it.
it says, "You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion."
So Egypt and Canaan were rocking places, weren't they? Apparently, this was something that used to go on.
But I just think it's interesting. The word choices all of a sudden shift for
Yeah.
because bestiality,
Yeah.
a lot of people compare it as the same thing, but
Yeah.
we go from abomination to perversion, which is
Yeah.
a completely different adjective.
Yeah.
And instead of saying lie with, now they're flat out saying give to yourself sexually or whatever,
Yeah.
sexualize.
And that word perversion is akin to the word abomination. That's actually kind of that's closer, but also you have to hear it with the ears of Israel. For us, that's a perversion. That's something that Israelites don't do. You know, it's out of our cultural norm. It breaks the rules, you know, those kinds of things. Good catch. Now I want to show you how obsessed, because, well, no, actually, let me hold on to that for just a second. So when we read the rest of the Holiness Code, beginning back in chapter 11, we see that we clearly don't buy into this in the same way that we do that one verse of Scripture. Leviticus 20, still kind of in the middle of all of this, but another one of those clobber passages is what I call, because people say, well, you ever read the Bible where that's called an abomination? Yeah, I've read it. Have you ever had any shrimp? But like, this is why I waited on this, because like back in chapter 18, verse 22, what this code is concerned about is a man lying with a man as with a woman. That's the phrase of interest. That could indicate, and certainly there's a lot of evidence from this world and this time, that concern for patriarchy. Men were a different bird in this world than men are now. Women were too. Women were basically property. A notch or two above the cattle, but still useful and cooked and had babies and worked on the farm, and you know, there's some places in the Bible where it looks like you could almost trade them. You know, I've got a good wife. She's not doing much these days. You can have her. And it was so a different world again. Okay. And that notion of male superiority, and even as a reflection of God, one of the reasons that we often think of God as a male is still a leftover from our patriarchy. Well, if there is a God, it's got to be a male, because you sure can't have a woman running the show, you know. And we hold that bias. And I tell you, you probably notice even in my preaching, I rarely gender God. If I do, it's a slip up. I usually just say the name God. And so sometimes if I'm telling a story, I'll say, and then God came and did this, and when God did this, God did that, and God. But you won't hear me say He very often. And I know one of the great influences in my life was several churches back. When an 80-year-old member of that congregation, a female, who was quite a pistol, and I loved her. She was courageous, man, unbelievable. But she said, you know, until this thing of gendering God became an issue, and I began to hear preachers once in a while even say, when God did this, she said this, and that's perfectly legit. And God says, I've created humanity in my own image. Well, humanity isn't just male. So, you know, honestly, I'm getting off subject a little, but really not, because these passions that we feel are part of the reason we read our Bibles like we do, and part of the reason we have preached the sort of things that we do. But she said, until I heard that, she said, I don't know that I really ever saw myself in God. You know, I didn't, until I've heard all my life we're created in God's image. But the image that she had seen all of her life was an old man, a big, powerful man. And it made a tremendous difference to her to understand God in a new way, and actually in a more biblical way.
Well, I think maybe some of that comes from too, because Adam was created first, and Adam was created in God's image, and then Eve was created from Adam. So I can see how
Yeah.
that.
But the text of that story says, male and female, God created them in His image.
Yeah.
So, and I just said His. So, different world, but this obsession then with the male superiority, male dominance of everything, that was seen as the way God made stuff. So it was really hard to violate that, you know, because it was looked at as, well, this is natural. And we're going to take on that word in a little bit later, in a little bit as well. This is the way nature works. This is the way God set things up. Men rule everything and everybody else works for the men. Right? Okay, so, and that was deeply embedded in the psyche of the women of this world too. It never occurred to them to go march in Washington for their rights. Thank God it occurred to somebody finally. But that obsession. This obsession is so ingrained. I want to show you a story. Look in the book of Judges. Joshua, then Judges. About 7 or 8 books in. We don't read from these a lot. But Judges chapter 9.
After Kings and Chronicles then? Oh, there. Nope.
Right after Joshua. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, then Joshua, Judges.
So where are we going in Judges?
Judges chapter 9, and I'm going to read verses 50 through 55. So, this is the story of Abimelech, who was a king, a ruler over Israel. And all the way down in verse 55, I'll pick up the story. Actually, let me go on up to the beginning of the paragraph, verse 50. Then Abimelech went to Thebez and encamped against Thebez and took it. But there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and the women and all the lords of the city fled to it and shut themselves in. And they went to the roof of the tower. Abimelech came to the tower, and he's attacking this city, you understand. Came to the tower and fought against it, and came near to the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire. But a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Immediately he called to the young man who carried his armor and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, so people will not say about me, a woman killed him." I really need you to get your head around this. This idea of patriarchy was so deeply embedded in the psyche of these people that if a woman in a battle scene dropped a big rock on the warrior's head and killed them, that warrior would have their armor bearer kill them, just so nobody ever said that they were killed by a girl. Right?
Gosh, it sounds like second grade.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is then, what does it mean then in this world to say a man lying with a man as with a woman? Because women were the passive partner in that circumstance. And the code and the culture of that code, if a man lies with a man, one of them's going to be in a passive position. And that was unthinkable. If you don't think it was unthinkable, then pull out your sword and kill me because of that rock that the woman dropped on my head. See? That's hard for us to get. And unfortunately, we haven't told anybody in the church about this. Because most of us preachers, this is why this is called Why I Changed My Mind. I grew up with a different mindset, just like everybody in this room did. Until somebody said, let's take a closer look at this. Is that really what the Bible says? And why in the world did translators turn those attackers of Lot's guests into men when that's not justified by the text at all? And okay, well, lying with a man as with a woman is an abomination, but what does that mean? Well, most scholars today will point to lots of other materials as well showing that the unthinkable thing was in that circumstance. And of course, it was happening, and they wouldn't have mentioned it. It was a common thing. There's never been a time in human history where there hasn't been gay people. We just didn't know about them because it's dangerous. But, created in God's image, right? There's a reason that we define that as only binary, as male and female, and things like that. There are cultural reasons that we did that. But if you think of God as creating male and female in God's image, then the best image of God would be of a trans person. Well, let me say that in the pulpit a couple of seconds.
I'll be listening.
And see if you still want me to be your pastor. And that kind of pressure is the reason your pastors haven't said this before. So we're all in this together. We have covered up this crime to save our butts, to save our careers, and also innocently because this is what my preachers taught me. This is what my Sunday school teacher taught me. This is what my mom and dad taught me. It's not easy to come to terms with, Grandma was wrong. But she was. She was completely wrong. It's just not in here. And it's not in Genesis where men are attacking men because that's not what it says. And in Leviticus, in the context of this holiness code and thinking about what must that mean in this kind of euphemistic way where the command is a man shouldn't lie with a man as with a woman. In the same Bible where people will have their sword bearer run them through just because a rock hit them on the head thrown by a woman. Right? Okay, follow along. Now we're going to go to 1 Corinthians to go. So the first three clobber passages are in the Old Testament. People sometimes say, well, we're not people of the Old Testament. Well, good. Take those 10 Commandments down. Because we don't follow those. Right? 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and I'm going to read verses 9 through 11. This is one of those occasions where translators decided that the word arsenokoitai meant sodomites, and translated it that way. 1 Corinthians, let me get there. It used to be in my Bible. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9 through 11. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes. Again, we're also getting a glimpse at the world that Paul's writing in. So there are male prostitutes that everybody knows about. Right? Male prostitutes, sodomites is in here. Even in my beloved NRSV. Sodomites, thieves, but also notice greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God. So even if the word sodomite was actually in here, could we justify saying, well, this is only about gay sex here? So, because we also have greedy. Anybody ever been greedy? Don't admit it. Because you know what the Bible says? You will not inherit the kingdom of God. Right? Idolaters. You know, all of these things. That word is the word arsenokoitai. Arsenokoitai. That is a Greek word that you can see in your study guide. That's what it looks like. That's how it's spelled. That is a word that is made up of two words. One of the words means male, and one of the words means bed. Male bed. That is the first time that this word is used in any Greek literature anywhere in the world. Nobody knows what it means. You can't find it. Paul made up a word. And the best we can say is, I don't really know what that means. You know, you're fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, greedy, drunkards. Let's see. Male prostitutes, male bed, thieves. I don't know what he meant to convey here. And since I don't know, it's probably not the greatest thing for me to just say, I think I'm going to go with sodomites. And when now we also know that even by the Old Testament, there's no way to justify calling what you have in mind when you say that word sodomy. There's not any justification for that, any more than saying Denvery. It's just the name of a city. Okay? So it's the first time that this is ever used in any Greek literature. Its meaning is unknown, but its translation as sodomy is completely arbitrary, but it's not harmless, is it? That's the problem. Is that while that choice of a word may have been completely arbitrary, and we kind of understand it based on the culture of translators and what we've always thought, it's completely arbitrary, but it is not harmless. I want you to just stop and think for just a minute. Even if all you're doing is thinking back to maybe the days of Stonewall in New York City in the very beginning of the LGBTQ rights kind of movement in the city. So in the 60s, you think about the gay, lesbian friends that you have, and those who have lived together for the last 40 or 50 years. You know, I remember, I tell this story, so I remember sitting in church with the two sweet little ladies that lived together and their special friends and all that. And I remember the day it dawned on me, oh my God! We've had gay people in the church forever. We just didn't say it out loud, you know? Yeah. I felt like an idiot when the first time it dawned on me, oh my goodness. You know, they're not special friends. You know, they're partners in life. They're lovers. They're people building a home together. They're, you know, I mean, and, but, you know, I forget the one we used to use for men.
Roommates.
Yeah, roommates. Yeah, they're roommates. Oh, well, that's cool. Guess I can split the rent then. Whatever. Right. But also notice that greedy and revilers, those are words we do know what they mean. And they're in this list of wrongdoers. All right? Now in 1 Timothy, another instance where a word got translated arbitrarily as sodomites. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verses 8 through 11 is what I want to read. That's toward the back of the New Testament. After most of Paul's letters.
Oh, wait.
First Timothy,
I skipped.
chapter 1, verse 8 through 11. Let me read this. Now we know that the law is good. And also, we probably ought to contextualize this because 1 Timothy, even though you've taken other classes with me, you know, there are letters in our Bible that say, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, writing to you, that Paul didn't write. Because it was a common practice in those days when you sort of represented the school of one of the great patriarchs or something, you would write in their name, you know. And so, you know, if I said in the name of Martin Luther King Jr., I write that, and that wasn't considered plagiarizing. That was honor. 1 Timothy comes from maybe the 90s all the way up to around 100 the year, so 60, 70 years after Jesus. 70 years of people becoming Christians and forming little house churches and things all over the place. Still in a period where most people really didn't distinguish between Christians and Jews. They just thought of Christianity as kind of a movement inside of Judaism, you know. And so another different world, okay. And also not Paul, but disciples of Paul, writing in Paul's name. Paul's earliest letter that we have probably comes from about 50, so already close to 20 years after Jesus when Paul was writing. And 1 Thessalonians is probably the oldest thing that we have from Paul, okay? And that was from Paul. And 1st and 2nd Corinthians are from Paul. Ephesians, probably not. Some of the other writings that are in Paul's name. In 1 Timothy, though, now we know that the law is good if one uses it legitimately. This means understanding that the law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and the disobedient, for the godless and the sinful. So the law is not even here for the law keepers. It's here for the law breakers, for the sinful, for the unholy and the profane, for those who kill their father and mother, for murderers and fornicators, sodomites. Boom, there it is. That word is actually the word malakos, which is a word that we actually do know what that means. And the meaning of that word is soft. But what is a soft man? Again, nobody can say with great conviction that word means sodomites, or that word even means gay men. The word means soft. And it's, you have to decide, well, I wonder what the writer of 1 Timothy meant. We know what he means by murderers. We know what he means by some of these other things, but in this list, which also when you see these lists in the New Testament, they're borrowing from that habit that we developed of developing holiness codes. So kind of lumping a bunch of stuff all together to say, bad. No, do this. Do this. Avoid these things. But, they're almost like, in Leviticus it gets very specific, but in most of the holiness codes that you see in the New Testament, it's just kind of a random list of bad things that we all know about, and everybody kind of got that. In fact, when you would come across a holiness code, the original readers wouldn't have exegeted that and done word studies. They heard that as almost as don't do, all the bad stuff. That's kind of how they heard those codes. And in the middle of those is this weird word, malakos, that means soft. So, or soft ones. But I don't know. And it was first translated as sodomites in the King James Version. So never until the late 1500s, 1600s, in that era, the King James translators translated that word as sodomites, when what it means is soft ones. and I'm not sure, what we're supposed to make of that. The meaning is unclear, but the translation as sodomites is completely unsupportable. That's a glitch of the translator.
So in which verse was the?
Verse 10.
Verse 10.
Yeah.
Okay, because I mean, in our,
Others
yeah,
did,
has whoremongers, and so I was just
Yeah.
wanting to make sure I was in the correct,
yeah.
okay.
I don't even know how soft ones becomes whoremongers either,
They
but
translate, I think it's some other text, they translate it as effeminate,
maybe.
but is that meaning,
But effeminate doesn't mean gay.
but did they throw that, did they throw it in there? Because in the NASB it says sexually immoral, homosexual, slave traders. So they just kind of threw that in there because they didn't know
Because
what it meant.
of course that's what soft ones mean.
Instead of fornicators.
Yeah, or anything else. I mean, what if?
Lazy and fat.
So
Yeah,
they don't know, they just make
yeah. And I imagine there's still that bias of, real man, not a soft one, So, could mean you just can't lift a lot of weight. I don't know. Which then that means me. Because I can't lift a lot of weight, So, we don't know what that word, I don't know why that word was chosen. Don't know how to translate it. I do know sodomites doesn't do it. That was a completely arbitrary decision. Look at Jude. And we're gonna finish this up in 1 week. Unless you wanna come back next week and just talk.
Sure.
Which I'd be willing to do. Jude, there's not a chapter in Jude. Jude is just Jude. There's only one chapter, one letter. Almost to the back, just before Revelation. So Jude. Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, which is kind of interesting. He says, okay, Jude verse 5 and 8, 5 through 8. 5 through 8. Now I desire to remind you, though you are fully informed, that the Lord, who once for all saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not keep their own position. So what looks like it comes into question here is like divine beings having relationships with mortals, which would have been kind of unthinkable. Now, relationships with a cow, that's cool. That's in Leviticus. Relationships with angels, that was a mixing of realities that people couldn't comprehend. Afterward, destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling. He has kept in eternal chains and deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. Likewise, and so Jude understands Sodom this way. Likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah, so he throws in Gomorrah, and the surrounding cities, so the metroplex, the surroundings, which in the same manner as they, indulged in sexual immorality. These divine beings did this like they did in Sodom and Gomorrah, but the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's not really what happened. So I don't know, maybe Jude hadn't read the story. I don't know why that comes out like this. But this is, in verse 5, that the Lord who once for all as they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust. Unnatural for divine beings and human beings. See? Serve it as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Jude, in Jude's mind, All of the divine kinds of beings that got on the wrong side are now someplace kind of like purgatory, or some holding pen where they're suffering and things like that. And he uses this example. There's crazy stuff in the Bible, by the way. Right? But that in this passage, it is the first time in the Bible that Sodom was connected with sexuality. They, the angels, indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust. They went after other flesh. But it's so it's associated with sexuality, but it's divine being sexuality, and also that's not what the story is. That didn't happen in the story that we know about. Maybe there's another story that stayed in the oral tradition, but we never got it written down somewhere. I don't know how to explain this, right? But it is the first time that the Bible used the word Sodom and connected that with sexual immorality explicitly. The other times, there was another word, and our translators put Sodom in there. This time, this author wrote that. I mean, that's what they told that story about Sodom and connected it. If you go back to Genesis chapter 6, I'll give you an example here. Oh, we're not going to make it. Well, yeah, we will.
We've got next
We
week.
have another week. Genesis chapter 6. Gosh. I'm going to read verse 1 through 4. The people began to multiply on the face of the ground. So this is right after creation, okay? The people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them. And the sons of God saw that they were, and that means the divine beings with God, the sons of God. And Jesus is called one of those, the Son of God. The sons of God saw that they were fair, the women, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. I guess that is something about these divine beings having sex with mortals, something of the divine spirit. I don't know. This is another world. But my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. We don't know who that is, but we do. There is some indication in other literature that Nephilim were considered like this whole divine population that was around. You know, as part of the kind of legendary way that people looked at the world. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward. And when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. So these deities and mortal women are having babies together, and it was a horrific wrong. And so, maybe Jude is carrying some of that. I really don't know. Okay. And lastly, is Romans, and we'll read that next week. But go ahead and actually let me just do this real quick. We'll read this and do this more exhaustively. But here's that word natural and unnatural that gets thrown in there. And that word in Greek is physis, P-H-I-S-I-S, if we transliterated it into English. Physis, or paraphysis. And that word just means out of the cultural norm. This just doesn't happen in our world. That kind of a thing. That's what it's about. So later on in chapter 11, that same word is used to describe what God did by grafting in Gentiles to the olive tree that was Israel. So God also does paraphysis, and that it's just like something happened that bends the norm, that isn't the way it goes usually, you know, that sort of a thing. That's the idea. We'll come back and look at those texts that are probably based on a natural theology, you know. Well, you can't find, gay sex in the animal kingdom. Well, except for those 400 or 500 times that you can, you know. So, but somebody writing in the first century and calling something natural is maybe not our guide for what is natural, okay? We'll come back next week, and since we've kind of covered the text, we'll read Romans so that we actually see the words there. And then we'll just have a free-for-all and just talk, okay? Okay. Well, that's it. Thank you.